on the sensations breath throughout the whole cycle of each breath. So we're now really in a flow state. We're flowing now. The practice is flowing much more easy now. And then the last stage here, it says, I shall breathe in, calming the composite of the body. I shall breathe out, calming the composite of the body. The composite just means the system of the body. And that's when the body really starts to settle down and starts to get in balance. And this happens at the very high levels of the Shamatha practice. From just before we achieve Shamatha, we're in the 9th stage, which we're going to look at in a few days, where we get in what's called equipoise, in balance. The body becomes completely balanced. And that can even go right up until we mentioned that the concentration practice, we're here and talking Shamatha, so this calming the composite is really in those final stages from stage 9 to Shamatha, but also we can develop higher levels of concentration called the jhanas. And this calming the composite can be right up until the 4th jhana, the fourth jhana. And in that stage, the body, the composite of the body is very calm, because actually in the 4th jhana, we stop breathing. We don't need to breathe anymore. That's how calm the body is. So this is one way of understanding these 4 lines from this Anapanasati Sutra in terms of the stages we go through in the phases of the mindfulness of breathing. Okay. So now if there's any questions about this practice or any of the practices we've done today, we've got opportunity for questions. Yeah.
About this practice of the rhythm of the breath, is it like a conceptual understanding, like, oh, now I'm breathing shallow, now I'm breathing long, or is it more like listening to a song of the breath and following on the rhythm?
Of course, the rhythm of the breath we pick up from noticing sensations in the body. I mean, otherwise, how do you know what the breath is doing? What is the rhythm? So the rhythm is basically just through noticing sensations and associating sensations with out-breath and in-breath. So the rhythm is a sort of composite of following those sensations. So again, we are simply observing the sensations in the body, and from that, the sensations of the breath in the body, and from that, understanding that one cycle of in and out breath took so long, and there was so much volume, and it wasn't actually quite smooth, it was quite rough. So we can understand that from just observing the fluctuations in sensations.
Do I note it in words?
You can, but you don't need to. I mean, if it helps you to stay focused, yes, as a beginner, same as the breathing in, breathing out, and counting the breath. But the more conceptual activity you bring in, the more it'll become a problem when you get deeper in. So as a beginner, at the beginning stages, yes, you can bring in a little bit of commentary and go short, rough, smooth, just to stay focused. Because to give a label to the rhythm, you have to be focusing on it. But again, it is conceptual activity, so I wouldn't overdo it, and then eventually you'll need to let go of that. Otherwise it just becomes artificial activity and becomes an obstacle then.
So then I would just be like listening to a song.
Well, you'd be observing the sensations directly, and from that knowing what the rhythm is doing.
Is there a possibility to integrate the integration between compassion and Shamatha meditation? It seems as if in the Shamatha meditation, calm, and stability, and even if it's on the mind, and where does the compassion arrive there? Or it comes only with vipassana? Or...
Remember, shamatha is stabilizing meditation, so the purpose of shamatha is to develop stability, to develop concentration. And then on that basis, we engage in all the other practices, as we saw, I think, earlier today, that stabilizing meditation is the basis of all analytical meditations, which include vipassana and compassion and loving kindness and so forth. So this shamatha practice is the basis of all other practices, because if we want vipassana, compassion, loving kindness, meditations and practices to be effective, we need to be focused in those practices. If we're not focused in those practices, trying to cultivate compassion, we're distracted and half asleep, then of course they're not going to be effective. So this is the basis for those. But of course we could say that simply observing the breath and calming the body is a little bit of compassion for ourselves at the physical level, but really this shamatha practice is the basis for these practices.
And when the object is the nature of the mind, at that time, compassion is there or not?
So again, when we're engaging in vipassana practice, if we want that to be effective, it needs to be on the basis of shamatha. In fact, we need to what's called unify them. We need to have what's called a union of shamatha and vipassana, observing nature of reality or nature of mind, whatever the object we're focusing on. Because again, without the shamatha, at best, we could have a little taste of nature of reality that will wear off very quickly. So we want to be able to fully penetrate. And to do that, we need a very calm, clear and focused mind. We need those unified. And I think I already mentioned briefly was that at our level, of course, we are individually practicing the two wings of wisdom and compassion. But actually, they're not two completely separate practices, because loving kindness and compassion is the natural expression of the nature of reality. So when we get to the point of directly realizing nature of reality, in other words, one way of saying that is we directly realize that everyone and everything is interdependent. When we realize that, the natural expression of that is loving kindness and compassion for everyone. But until we get to that point, we need to work on them individually. But then they sort of come together at that point. Thank you.
It was the experience was that I was the breath. Like I disappear and there were only the breath.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very nice.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So I'm saying if this is, I thought maybe it's to identification with the breath or...
Well, of course, that, and we're going to look at this in some detail when we talk about the Vipassana practice in day 9, but now, of course, we have a sense of me, and it's actually a false sense of me. We're sort of grasping onto this independent me. So we have a strong sense of me in everything we do because we're grasping onto this seemingly independent agent. But in these sorts of practices, in any shamatha practice, when we're improving mindfulness, then what's happening actually is we are now becoming more and more focused on the object, which means we're not so much focusing on the agent who's doing the practice or the activity. So then this self-grasping will start to reduce to the point where if we really are fully present, there'll be no sense of agent at all. In fact, I briefly also mentioned earlier that in the shamatha practice there are 3 qualities of mind that we'll start to experience more and more: the clarity, non-conceptuality and bliss. So the non-conceptuality is that there's not only stillness, but that means there's no separate agent. There's no me here and breath there. So this is a sign that actually the practice is going in a good direction, that we're starting to become more and more fully present with the object and not so much grasping on the me. Good.
I didn't really understood the 4 phases.
Right.
How do I make use of this?
Right. So again, the verse here is breathing in long, one knows I breathe in long. Breathing out long, one knows I breathe out long. So this first statement can be understood or interpreted as the initial phase of mindfulness of breathing. That when we sit down and do mindfulness of breathing, full body, abdomen, nostrils, rhythm, doesn't matter, what we notice is that our breath is long, meaning for one cycle of breath takes quite a long time, and also usually a lot of volume, and also quite irregular, not regular. So that's what we tend to notice at the first stage. But then as we get into the mindfulness of breathing practice, the mind settles down, the breathing settles down, then at the next stage it says, breathing in short, one knows I breathe in short. Breathing out short, one knows I breathe out short. Meaning what we're going to notice is as we get into this practice and the mind and the body settle down, the duration of one breath will get shorter and the volume will get less. So that's in the second stage that we'll start to notice that. The breath will get shorter, volume less. Because the mind and the body are settling down. And then it says, one trains thus, I shall breathe in, experiencing the whole body, I shall breathe out, experiencing the whole body. So the whole body can mean this, but also this statement can be interpreted as the whole body of the breath, meaning the whole cycle of a breath. Meaning now we are continuously aware throughout the entire cycle of each breath. Meaning now we're really getting into into really a flow state in this practice, that we are more and more fully present with the breath the entire time. Because even before, maybe there's even though the breath is rhythmic and subtle, we're not fully aware of the breath the entire time. There can be still slight interruptions. But now we're really much more, means the quality of our attention is getting much better. It's not as fragmented as before. And then the last statement says, I shall breathe in, calming the composite of the body. I shall breathe out, calming the composite of the body. So calming the composite of the body is now really talking about the body really becoming very calm, but particularly, I mentioned, and we'll talk more about this in a few days' time, this idea of physical pliancy, that the body becomes completely flexible and serviceable. And this really starts to happen just at the time of Shamatha, but also here that we have higher levels of concentration than Shamatha. They're called 4 levels of jhana. And if we get up to the 4th jhana, the body is so calm that actually we stop breathing. We don't breathe anymore. So that's 4th one is sort of describing from more or less from Shamatha up to those levels. That's what we're going to notice.
I wonder if it's possible to go back to the psychological fusion.
Cognitive fusion. Yeah, sure.
I have a kind of dilemma. I live in a small community, and I have an elder man whom I am his supporting friend.
You're supporting him.
Him as a friend.
You are supporting him. Okay.
And we are in good. I go to him.
Sure.
And he has a very. He's doing something which I don't agree,
Mm-hmm.
and it disturbs me a lot.
It
disturbs
disturbs you a lot. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I understand I have to think about him and to develop. I have compassion to him. I
Sure.
understand him, his
Sure.
whole situation, but try to keep our friendship, I'm confused because I can't act and do something to change the situation.
Okay.
Because it's a long time habit and it's very sensitive situation.
Sure.
But,
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can't, there is a conflict inside
Sure,
me.
sure. And again, I think sometimes this really comes because of the cognitive fusion, is that you really like the person, you want to help the person, but you really don't like the behaviour at all. And you can't really do much about it. So if you stick the person and the behaviour together, then it becomes awkward, because then it seems like liking the person means liking the behaviour, that they come as one package. No? So if we don't do the cognitive fusion, then we can still like the person and try and help the person, but at the same time not tolerate that bad behaviour. And of course, in terms of compassion, we need to have the wisdom. And if we have the wisdom, also may say, you know, how to try and help the person with that. But if it's a very strong habit, as you said, maybe there's nothing much we can do about that. And so wisdom says, with the compassion, you know, okay, I can't really do much now. And then, but of course, if it's negatively impacting you, wisdom may say, okay, I'd like to help and support that person, but if I spend too much time with them, that negative behaviour has, well, obviously a negative impact on them and you. So then you may say, okay, then I need to step back a little bit, still have compassion and help them, but to give yourself some space from that person. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed, they get overwhelmed, and then you're not helping. Then it's a problem. So, you know, of course this is not easy, it's difficult, but so sometimes the compassionate thing to do in these very difficult situations is to step back. Because if we keep in that situation, that we get overwhelmed and they behave badly, so they're increasing that negative habit, we react, and that's not helpful.
But I want to say the negative behavior is not towards me.
Sure.
It doesn't matter.
Sure. But I mean, if you are reacting to that, if you're somehow reacting to that and not being able to respond, then you need to give yourself a little bit of space, physical space. I think there was a question down the back here. Yeah?
My question is about anger.
About anger, yeah?
Or maybe, I don't know. I was expecting to get some framework to work with my anger.
Some
Framework or rules, steps, how to deal with
Okay,
my anger.
yeah,
It
okay,
was more about
sure, right.
this person and
Sure. So how to deal with anger is very similar in terms of what we briefly looked at yesterday in terms of attachment. So the first point is to have a clear understanding of anger. So remember, in Buddhism, anger, as the word is used in Buddhism, implies an intention to harm.
so not just frustration or
Yeah, okay.
impatience.
Sure. Coming to that. So that's the first thing, is to have a clear understanding, because otherwise we may feel like, you know, Buddhism says get rid of anger, and we may put in the same category then we're not allowed to use any forceful language or behaviour, because sometimes in psychology that sort of forceful behaviour is called anger. But that forceful behaviour with a motivation of compassion, of course, is not anger in Buddhism. So again, the first is to have a clear understanding. Then, like attachment, and this applies for irritation and actually all mental afflictions, if we want to be able to deal with any mental affliction, we need mindfulness. Because if we don't have mindfulness, what normally happens is some stimulus comes, and before we know it, we're already reacting. Our mind is out of control with the mental affliction and we're reacting. Then you know, if our mind is already out of control, well, if we've already reacted, then the only thing we can do is sort of apologise for saying and doing things we didn't want. Of course, even before that, the mental affliction will take hold of our mind and we're out of control. So if we're already out of control, the only thing we can really do is cut from that stimulus, get out of there. But again, that's a last resort. What we want to do is catch it before it gets to that point. And to be able to do that, we need mindfulness. So the shamatha practice, regardless of what object we're using, breath or the other objects we'll be working with the next couple of days, we'll develop that mindfulness, strengthen it. So we will be able to notice when these mental afflictions start to arise. Because now what happens is there's a build-up, and our threshold of consciousness is sort of up here. So there's already a period where it's building up and we're not noticing it. It's only when it sort of pops up here that we notice it. And usually by that time, we're already out of control. So what we want to do through the shamatha practice is bring that threshold of awareness down through improving mindfulness so that we can pick it up earlier, much earlier. And then if we can pick it up much earlier, again, whether it's craving, attachment, irritation, anger, jealousy, whatever the mental affliction is, if we can pick it up very early, then one very effective thing to do is just observe it. Just go, oh, interesting. Look at that. And watch it, and it can't go anywhere. If we can observe it, it can't go anywhere. It can only go somewhere if you identify with it and follow it or try to suppress it. If you just observe it, it can't do anything. It can't continue.
When I notice emotion, it is on a body level. I feel
Sure.
that
Right, so...
It's not a mental level.
Right, yes, sure. Okay, good. So, tomorrow we're going to do the practice of observing the mind, and of course, together with that, observing thoughts, emotions, everything that comes up in the mind. Now, as I mentioned already, generally many people find this more challenging than the breath for two reasons. One is the mind is more subtle. It's not a physical, tangible object like the breath, and we don't have a habit of observing our thoughts and emotions. So therefore, what we can do as well, particularly in the beginning phases of this, is, as you said, is when something starts to come up, some mental affliction, when some mental affliction starts to come up, there's always a corresponding physical effect in the body. Always. Because mental afflictions agitate the mind. And when we agitate the mind, something happens in the body. So then, what we can do together with that is observe what's going on in the body. For example, if irritation or anger is arising, usually some tightness comes in the body. Maybe the breathing starts to get a little bit more coarse. If we can start to notice that, we go, oh, hang on, something's coming here. So then, we can observe that in the body or observe in the mind, whichever we find easier. And the same thing will apply. We won't get caught up in it. So we can observe the corresponding changes in the body if we want.
What I did is that I noticed my behaviors and I noticed sensations in the body. And then I started to ask myself. So I started a mental conversation with myself.
Sure.
Is it
Yeah. So what we can do is, again, if we notice something happening in the body, some tightness or something, then we can go, okay, something's going on here. And then we can switch to look at our mind and see what's going on in the mind.
Mine was quiet, no phone. So I started to ask, does this bother you? Is this?
Again, probably what's happening is there actually is some mental activity going on, but it's still down here. So for us, it seems like our mind is quiet. But if you engage in the shamatha practice, that threshold will go down. And then, when you have this, you'll see actually something starting to happen in the mind. So this is going to be helpful. And again, we can simply observe that, or for all mental afflictions, I think, we can use various antidotes. to the mental affliction, apply some antidote. And we can do that often from the two wings of practice of wisdom and compassion. The wisdom wing, how to use that as an antidote, we're going to look at in more detail on day 9. And the compassion wing we've already started to look at yesterday and today, and we'll continue that in the next couple of days. So we can use those as antidotes. So it's good to have like a toolbox of possibilities. Because sometimes this works better, sometimes this works better. If we've only got one thing and it doesn't work, then okay, we're stuck. But if we've got 3 or 4 things that we can try, maybe one of those will be effective in cutting the mental affliction.
What I did, I asked myself, Ronnie, I see something is bothering me. Like, I met myself as a child. Is it
Sure, yeah. So again, we can use that conceptual framework to give ourselves some space. So if you can give it a name, then it becomes an object. And we'll be doing this in the practice tomorrow, is when these mental events come up, again, usually we just get caught up. But one thing that can be helpful that we're going to introduce tomorrow is when something comes up, give it a name. Give it a name. Like irritation, anger, frustration. If you give it a name, you're free of it because it becomes an object. It's not, you don't identify with it. So that's helpful.
So, connected to what's coming first? The sensation, the thought, like in the mental event. What's coming first, like to catch it in the beginning?
Yeah, I think that they sort of come together, but you may find that one is easier for us than the other to notice. And of course, each one can affect the other. You know, the body can affect the mind and the mind can affect the body as well. I mean, so we can have some anger coming up which can cause the tension in the body. But often you find that very early on they'll start to come together. That soon as some little irritation comes, already there's an effect in the body. So usually they'll sort of rise together.
So it's a thought that makes the irritation in the body. It's a thought that
the thought or an emotion has a corresponding effect in the body. They go together. So when we have anger, for example, coming up, together with that usually have a lot of tightness and so forth, tension in the body.
What is an anger? It's thought about another one.
Well, here anger is the intention to harm. The intention to harm. Okay. Any other questions? We've maybe one last question before we go for dinner. Yeah.
In the compassion meditation, you said to inhale with the compassion.
The black smoke.
Yeah, the black smoke, and I took like big breath. Is this supposed? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, with this practice, and we're going to go further into this practice in the coming days, we tend to, this loving kindness and compassion practice, we tend to conjoin it with the breath because it helps us to stay focused in the practice. But you can do this practice without using the breath as a support, but it's sort of a helpful way to focus and stay on track. And of course, the main thing in these practices, you know, we saw that in the loving kindness, we're visualizing this light going out, and the compassion visualizing smoke coming in. The most important thing in these practices is not that we have good visualization, that we have nice looking light and sort of dark looking smoke and that everything's very clear. That's not the important thing. The important thing is, in the loving kindness, the wish to give them happiness. In the compassion, the important thing is the wish to take the suffering from them. That's important. The visualization, again, helps us stay on track. Otherwise, if we don't have this wish